I'm Gold Derby News and Features Editor Ray Richmond, and I'm welcoming Declan Lowney, who directed what appears to be the final episode of Apple TV Plus's Ted Lasso, to our Gold Derby Meet the Emmy Nominees TV Directors panel. Declan, as someone who's done a lot of work on Ted Lasso, I suppose it's impossible to be objective, but what do you believe explains this show's runaway, almost obsessive popularity with viewers, critics, and the TV Academy alike?
I think in studying why Ted Lasso has been so successful, Ray, I think it's important to go back to when Ted Lasso arrived. And I think Ted Lasso arrived when the world was in a pretty terrible state. We were just in the middle of our first lockdown, weren't we? We were just coming out. And I know everybody needed the equivalent of a weighted blanket, as some sort of a hug. And I think Ted Lasso went a long way toward providing that. It was also a new sort of comedy, Comedy could be a bit nasty sometimes, can't it? There are jibes at people. People are the butt of jokes. And I think Ted Lasso arrived with a comedy that was somehow fresher and somehow more compassionate and more willing to see people's flaws and not laugh at them. So I think all those things came together, and just the timing of it, I think it just arrived at a really important time for us.
A kinder, gentler comedy. You recently said on a podcast, and I quote, "When you're directing a TV show, there's always a godlike figure standing behind you in the background with overall guidance." In the case of Ted Lasso, is that godlike figure named Jason Sudeikis?
Yeah.
And how hands-on is he when you're directing?
Jason Sudeikis could certainly be a godlike presence. Jason will be in front of the camera, however, most of the time. So he's depending on you to be him behind you as well. It's a tough, being the showrunner and being in the show is a tough call, and Jason handles that extremely well. But he is a guy who has a very fixed view on how this show should look and feel, and he's generally pretty spot on with his observations. He knows what he wants, and that makes it exciting as well, because you've got somebody saying here's why it's got to be the way it is, rather than just here's the way it's got to be. So that's always brilliant work. Going to work on that show was a bit like having an education film almost every day. Every day you went to work.
I'll bet. Let's talk about the final episode of season 3 that you were nominated for, So Long, Farewell, which we're presuming is the series finale as well. What a whirlwind of emotions that had to call up, Declan, not just for you, but for everyone on that set.
Yes, I mean, So Long, Farewell was the title, and it was so long, and it was farewell because it was 73 minutes, and that made it long, and it was the last one, so there's the farewell. But yes, that's 34 episodes in, so there's a lot of stories to wrap up, and that's why the show had to be quite so long. But I know Jason is somebody who always feels, people aren't going to complain about it being 10 minutes too long. The fans love it, and they love to spend more time with the characters, and let's try and wrap stories up properly instead of rushing through it.
I was wishing it would go on even longer. I hadn't realized that much time had passed by the end, actually.
On, Ray, because we didn't all want to keep shooting.
No. I imagine if the fans had their way, you'd still be shooting.
Yes.
There's so many poignant moments scattered throughout that episode, so many farewells and elements of closure. I mean, as a director, are you concerned at all with making sure things moved along toward the conclusion at a steady pace? That had to be quite the challenge.
Yeah, that's a difficult one, because you have to let things take as long as they take, and the nature of Ted Lasso is that some of the show is written as it goes on, and so you think you've got a 1-page scene today, but by the time you get there in the morning, it's become a 2.5 or a 3-page scene, because Jason's felt the need to put more dialogue and more stuff in to try and wrap up stories. And so you shoot it long, and then we try and condense it down in the edit. But a lot of stuff is the length it is because that's how long it took. And particularly the scene that for me brings closure for a lot of people was the scene in the locker room at halftime, when Ted gives them a very short speech about going back out and being the best versions of themselves, and how, we're down 2-1 or whatever, but we could still do it. And he says, anybody got anything else to say? And Sam Obisanya reaches into his locker and takes a piece of yellow paper and puts it on the desk. And then Jamie Tart takes out a piece, and suddenly people start to take out these yellow pieces of paper, and we realize they've all got a piece of the Believe sign that was torn up way back at the start of season 2. And everybody's held on to a piece, and people have put them, Isaac's got his tucked under his armband, somebody else has it in their shin pad. Jamie Tart, I think, has his in the book that Ted gave him in episode 3 back in season 1, the book that meant nothing to him. So it's beautiful to see that everybody has invested so much in their piece of paper, and when they put all the piece of paper back together on the table in the middle of the room, and we look down, and then they start to rearrange them into the Believe poster. And it's a beautiful moment, that. But what I love particularly is when everyone's standing around looking down at it, and they bend down to start moving the piece of paper around. You've got this huge group of 25 people around this table in the middle of the room. They all bend down, but the only 2 people left standing are Ted and Nate, opposite each other. And so there's a beautiful moment between the 2 of them where they just exchange look. And we know by then, Ted has completely forgiven Nate. It is all okay. And Nate feels at home again to be back in Richmond. It's a beautiful moment, but I just love that all the heads dip down and you're just left with the 2 guys giving each other the eyes across the table.
And that moment really is indicative of how that whole Believe motif extends way beyond sports into life. And I think that's in a lot of ways what people were responding to with Ted Lasso. As a freelance director on a series like Ted Lasso, isn't it more or less like you're making less a matter of making your own imprint and more of don't screw up the style and tone we've already established here?
I think it is don't screw up the tone and style we've already established. And, particularly if you haven't been around for the first few episodes, when those directors are setting the tone and the style, and your job is, to deliver what the show has managed to succeed at by then, which is to deliver that show that they all, that people know and love. But that's not to say a director can't come in and go, oh, I had this idea for, how about if we did this? How about if we tried that? And there's always room. Jason's always keen for directors to explore or to experiment, as long as you're not going crazy and going, let's do it all in one shot. And that's, within reasons, I think there's room for directors to have their own input. But a big part of what you're bringing is your ability to get it done on time and to get it done in a way that keeps everybody happy. It's a very, very happy team. That show, and I think that's really important, that energy and that dynamic and that relationship between the crew and the director and the actors, all that stuff is really important on any show, but particularly here because it is a team effort.
What was the best thing for you about being a part of this show and that team, Declan? Did it make you more popular at parties?
Ted Lasso certainly added enormously to my social cachet, I would say. It was an amazing experience for somebody who's not, I've only done a bunch of American TV shows before this. So for somebody who's a slightly outsider wanting to try and break in here, it was it opened a huge amount of doors for me. And it was very important to understand how the show worked and understand the dynamics of the writers, execs, how that works. The best part of it was being very much part of the team. It is such a team effort. When we make shows in the UK, you usually, with comedy, we make 6s. So one director is hired and creates and makes and directs all 6. And you feel part of the ownership. And I guess American TV, it is a little harder for directors perhaps to feel the same sense of ownership because you're visiting. It's a bit like a conveyor belt. But I did feel very at home and I did feel very part of the family, and that's important.
Did you, you've worked in European TV as well. I guess this is a much different dynamic.
Yes, it really is. Well, the obvious one is the budget's way bigger, and Ted Lasso is an expensive show to make because of the many different elements and the huge cast. And so being able to spend money and being able to spend money properly was fantastic. Not having to cut your cloth every step of the way, which is what happens on our smaller budgets in the UK. It's a question of cloth cutting and making it fit. It was fantastic to have the time and the luxury to be able to spend money on making it right.
Well, I think we're going to wrap things here. All 3 seasons of Ted Lasso currently stream on Apple TV+. Declan Lowney, congratulations on your Emmy nomination. I know it's not your first. Best of luck at the forthcoming Emmys, and thanks for joining us at Gold Derby.
Thanks so much, Ray. Delighted to help. Thank you. Take care.
You as well.